all beige all the time. For a while there, it felt like we were constantly being inundated with very neutral, very beige interiors. They were everywhere. But like any design trend, the look began to fade and there was the inevitable backlash. And the term sad beige was coined to describe the aesthetic. Now, many of us, myself included, were relieved to see a return to color in interiors. But I recognize that not everyone feels that way. Some people just prefer a more neutral space, and that is totally fine. We should all feel free to embrace whatever color scheme we want when it comes to our homes. And neutral spaces can be great. There are lots of beautiful, well-designed neutral interiors. So whether traditional, eclectic, contemporary, whatever your personal design style, there is a neutral iteration of it out there. Neutral interiors can be stylish and interesting and even a bit edgy. So in this video, we are going to take a closer look at some very cool neutral interiors and identify the characteristics that make these spaces so great. Let's get right into it. Color. Now, in a video about neutrals, you might be wondering why I'm talking about color, but hear me out. Neutrals are, of course, colors. They're just a very specific category of muted colors that are devoid of much saturation or intensity. When we're defining neutrals, we're usually talking about such colors as whites and creams, beiges, tans and browns, taupes, grays, and of course black. So when we talk about decorating with neutrals, the way in which we go about this can have a massive impact on the final result. Some people might want to play it really safe and stick to like one prevalent neutral in their space. So an example of this could be an all white or an all beige interior. Now, there are definitely some very skilled, very talented people out there that can pull off a look like this, but for most of us, it's just going to lead to an interior that feels a bit flat and lifeless. So my advice is to mix your neutrals. A combination of tints, tones, and shades is going to lead to a much more interesting and dynamic space. If you prefer warmer neutrals, this might mean a mix of creams, tans, and browns, whereas if you prefer cooler neutrals, this could mean combining whites, taupes, and grays. Or you could decide you want to bring warm and cool neutrals together in a space. And then there's black. So you might want to just use a few small black accents just to help anchor the space. Or if you're feeling really daring and dramatic, you might want to use black in larger doses. But in neutral spaces, black can be a really great addition. Another really important consideration in a neutral room is contrast. A lack of contrast is one of the most obviously overlooked elements of the sad beige interior. Without contrast, a space can lack definition. Combining a variety of light, medium, and dark neutrals can provide the contrast your space needs. Another way to add contrast is through the use of lighting. The strategic use of lighting to highlight certain elements or cast shadows onto others can also be an effective way to create contrast in an interior. Pattern. Pattern can be a great way of adding interest to a neutral room. This could be a wallpaper, a fabric, an area rug, or even the natural pattern in a piece of stone. Texture. Texture is another element that can make a big difference in a neutral space. A room lacking in texture can feel really flat. A variety of texture adds interest to a neutral interior. And textures can also create a form of contrast, using shiny with matte or rough against smooth. Materials. Mixing materials is another important consideration in a neutral interior. It's a really effective way to add character and interest. A contemporary interior with a lot of glass and concrete can feel much warmer with the introduction of wood. Or combining, say, polished metals with more rustic finishes can be an unexpected source of visual tension. And speaking of visual tension, avoid playing it too safe in a neutral interior. Mix different styles, incorporate some vintage, look for unique pieces that are going to provide an element of surprise. Neutral, but definitely not boring. Okay, now that we have discussed some of the key considerations that make for a well-designed neutral interior, let's look at some inspiring spaces that are definitely not sad beige. Okay, this first room I just think is really beautiful. Now, there is a green sofa. Technically green, not always categorized as a neutral, but it is a very muted green. I think we can excuse it. And the rest of the room, very neutral. Now there isn't a lot of color variation. There's a lot of cream happening here, but I think where the contrast comes in is more due to the architectural details. So you have that beautiful curved staircase, and the way that the light hits that staircase, it gives you some areas of light and shadow, and I think that creates the contrast and the visual interest. And then I think there's some really interesting sort of decorative elements happening here. You've got skirting on the sofa, and you've got this fringe on the ottoman, and those are elements that you would probably see more typically in a much more traditional space, but I think they're a really interesting and unique choice for a room that actually does feel quite contemporary. So here we have a room, it's got a lot of white, it's got a lot of gray, it runs the risk of potentially feeling a bit cold. So what they have done to counteract that is they've brought in a real mix of pieces. So there's a mix in materials, especially bringing in the wood, that really helps to warm everything up. And then there's also a real mix of styles. They've got modern pieces, they've got antiques, and I think this mix just adds a lot of personality and character, and it makes the space feel really interesting and unique rather than feeling sterile. So here we have a room that I think is just a great example of a very well-designed neutral interior. You've got a mix of light, medium, and dark tones. You've got pattern that they've brought in through this area rug. And then of course there's a gallery wall, which I always love. This is a great one. Notice how they have that sculptural sort of wall sconce, and then they've got the round pieces of art as well, just helping to break up all of the rectangles on the wall. I think this has just been really well executed. So I think this is just a very cool living room, and while the space for the most part is very neutral, they have brought in a little bit of color through art and books. It's very subtle, but it has a lot of impact, and I think this is a great example of how you can introduce just a little bit of color into a neutral room. There are a lot of great things happening in this room, but something that really stood out for me was the sectional. It's a lot grayer and cooler than the other finishes in the room. And I think for a lot of us who maybe are stuck with some millennial gray that we don't know what to do with, this is a great example of how you can combine those grays with warmer neutrals and how they can really work together nicely. So what really drew me to this space was the black on the wall. If you take that away, I think this room runs the risk of feeling a bit flat and lifeless. The contrast that the black wall provides just really instantly makes the whole space feel so much cooler. I picked this space because I think if you look at the room itself, it feels like a very basic apartment that I'm sure a lot of us are very familiar with, but the way that they have styled it, I think really elevates it. There's an interesting mix of styles and finishes. They brought in some texture, especially in that piece of art. And then the mix of chairs. You know, if you find some random chairs on Facebook Marketplace and there isn't a complete set, you could totally do something like this. I think this looks awesome. So this bathroom, I think, is just really well designed. You know, sometimes these really contemporary bathrooms run the risk of feeling a bit flat and lifeless, but they've got pattern here in the tile. They've got the contrast between the light and the dark with the black finishes, and then they've brought in the texture of the reeded glass, and I think it's all just been very well executed. Now, if you're looking to sort of emulate this look, check out IKEA, because they do have these reeded glass cabinets that I think are very much in keeping with this look. Now this kitchen, it's a pretty small space, it's pretty basic, but the way that they have elevated this room is through the use of materials. I love the floor tile, I love the honed finish on the countertops. The wood grain on those lower cabinets is gorgeous. There's just a real level of sophistication and elegance to this room. So I just was immediately drawn to this little dining space. I just think that this is very cool. Now, when it comes to contrast, not a lot of contrast in terms of color. Everything's pretty monochrome. It's all pretty soft and muted, but the contrast comes into play through the materials and the styling. So you've got this polished chrome, which is such a great juxtaposition against all of the other softer, warmer finishes. And then you have these sculptural pieces, like these dining chairs, which I just think are really unique and interesting, and everything's just been really well done. So this room to me feels like a lot of new build homes that are trying to emulate a more traditional look, and it's not really my taste. But I appreciate the mix of pieces that they've brought into the space that feel a little less predictable. The mix of art, the contemporary light fixture, the black finish on the fireplace. It's still not really my thing, but it's at least more interesting and unique than it could have been. So I am going to commend them for that. So my favorite thing about this space is the shelving. I think without it, this room could feel a bit bland and boring, but floor to ceiling shelves like this is a great way of adding some architectural interest. And the other great thing about shelves is that changing up how you style them can really change the entire look of the room. Such a great office. I think the arched built-in has so much impact. The desk is gorgeous, a really unique piece. And then the purple table. In an otherwise neutral space, I think it's really fun and surprising. There's a lot that I like in this room. I think the use of black and white is really striking. I think there's a real eclectic mix of pieces that just keeps things feeling really unique and interesting. A bit of a Scandinavian vibe, especially with that fireplace. Just really cool, great styling. I really like what they've done here. Such a great, warm, inviting space. I love the use of materials. I like the mix of textures. And I think that mid-century modern is an era that did neutral interiors really well. So if you're looking for some inspiration, it's definitely an era you're going to want to keep in mind. All right, friends, we have reached the end of the video. Now, if you want to see any of these inspiration images more closely, I will, as always, have them up on a Pinterest board. The link will be in the description. Thank you so much for being here. I hope we see you again next time, and bye for now.